What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of TLG Live. For those that don't know me, my name is John Nia. I'm one of the partners at Trowbridge Law Group. Today's topic is actually pretty relevant, pretty topographical, I would say, especially with everything that's going on in the world. Um, I just wanted to talk about some of the issues that our clients face as far as COVID, right? So Gene actually did a video before about some of the additional risks that syndicators have to disclose because of the coronavirus. One of them being the fact that it's that much harder to inspect a property right now because, to go inside a unit, someone's a tenant's unit, might not be possible right now because of certain local regulations not allowing, landlords to go in and inspect units. Another issue is the fact that um, it's much harder to evict tenants right now that aren't paying rent because of moratorium on evictions. And depending on your local regulations, those might be more um, strict than others, right? So those are the two risks that Gene talked about in his previous video, and he talks about where you need to disclose those, and or if you're an investor, where do you look to find those disclosures in the PPM. So if you haven't seen that video yet, go ahead and check it out. We'll try to leave a link to it in the description below. But there's a couple other things that we haven't really talked about that have changed because of COVID, and it's pretty obvious when you think about it. But a lot of people right now are getting sick, and a lot of people are dying. So, what happens if you, the syndicator, gets COVID? What happens if you get really sick and you have to be admitted to the hospital for a long period of time, or worst case scenario, you die. And then also the issue of what happens when an investor of yours gets COVID and maybe unfortunately passes away. So let's talk about the first issue first. um, so if you, the syndicator, get COVID, I mean, what that's really about is continuity, right? Having a continuity plan in place to make sure you have someone or some mechanism in place to oversee the property, oversee the investment, if in case something were to happen to you, right? So that's one of the big things that we always talk about. One of the things that Gene always talks about is four questions that investors always ask, and one of them is, what happens to my money if something happens to you? And right, that's something that you got to think about right now, especially with COVID. If you get really, really sick and you pass away, what's going to happen to your investors? What's going to happen to the investment? So it's really important to have continuity plan, and we always recommend to at least partner with one other person. So find a partner to do your syndication with. If you don't have a business partner, then the next best thing you could do is to maybe have a family member, a spouse, whoever it may be within that manager LLC with you, so that if you were to pass away, that manager LLC is still there, right? Your spouse or whoever's in that manager LLC is still alive and able to oversee. Maybe they don't have the expertise to oversee the property anymore, but at least they're there to maintain the structure and potentially appoint or elect someone new to take over and oversee the project on behalf of the investors. So that's the first thing that you need to think about when you're discussing increased risk because of COVID. But the second question is, what happens if something happens to your investors? An investor gets COVID and passes away. Well, you need to look at the organizational documents for the company. That is what's going to govern, what happens to the investors' ownership interest if they pass away. So if you're using an LLC, like what our clients use, then you got to look at the operating agreement. And in our operating agreements, we have a section about disassociation, which is, what happens to an investor when they effectively get kicked out of the LLC, right? So if an investor dies, they're effectively leaving the LLC because they're not there anymore to they're not there anymore, right? So in that section, it talks about the fact that whoever inherits the deceased investor's interest, they will inherit only the economic interests, so rights to distributions, but they will not inherit um, other interests, right? So voting interests, for example, right? So if an investor gets COVID and they're going by our operating agreements, then what would happen is you look at the investor's will, or if they don't have a will, then the succession of their estate. Whoever succeeds to their estate would own the economic interest in the company, so they have the right to receive distributions from the syndication, but they don't have a right to vote on any of the matters, right? So what do our clients need to do if that were to happen? Obviously you need uh, you know evidence of the person passing, so usually a death certificate, and then you'll wait for the state to process, and then whoever succeeds to that interest, they'll need to basically provide uh, their information so that you could give that to your CPA for future distributions, right? um, Another issue that has come up with some of our clients is what happens if the investor is a married couple and one of the spouses passes away. What happens to the interest then? Well, then in that case, you have to look at how are the investors holding their interests in the company. If it's a married couple with joint tenant with right of survivorship, then in that case, the spouse that passes away, their interests in the company automatically pass to the surviving spouse. And if that were the case, then the syndicator doesn't really need to do anything, because it kind of gets taken care of automatically because of just the way that works, right? Joint title with right of survivorship, right? If they hold it differently, right? So, for example, if it's held tenants in common, then what would happen if one tenant in common dies? The interest doesn't go to the surviving tenant in common; it goes to based on that person's will, the person who dies. So, if it's a married couple and they're holding it as tenant in common, then the deceased spouse, you have to look at their will and see what their will says as far as where that interests go. Another aspect of that to think about is, what if they're in a community property state? Then you need to look at, community property rules for that particular state and that particular investment. So uh, basically, there's a lot of issues with what happens with an investment if the investor passes away. And the point I'm trying to make is to you got to think about these things before you put together your offering, put together your company, put together your investment for investors, because that's what investors are going to ask you, right? So they're always going to ask you, what happens to my money if something happens to you, and then what happens if something happens to me? It has to be there in the documents, and it's especially important right now because, as we all know, a lot of people are getting sick, and a lot of people are passing away because of COVID. So, unfortunately, that's just the reality of our life these days, and it's important that you plan for those things. So, anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Hope it was informative. Today is Thursday again, so that means we got another episode of TLG Talks today at noon. Tune into that. As always, feel free to reach out to us. Our website is trowbridgelawgroup.com. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week.